Hello and welcome to Once Upon a Town, a deep dive into the history of Franklin, Mass. I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
I'm Joe Landry.
On today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Flax Block, a corner area right in downtown that's had many of the most famous businesses in Franklin through the years.
All right, well, let's begin. Here we have a picture of the Flax Block as it appears today. And here's a picture that shows the Flax Block, or what the area looked like back in the late 1860s. You can see that there was like a general store there with a porch on the front. Because we didn't call it a porch back then, they called it a piazza. I don't know why it's just another name for a porch, I guess. But you can see there was a piazza on the front. And we're going to talk about that piazza in a few minutes and the significance of that. But this picture shows a bunch of people lined up. And I'm thinking, originally I thought maybe this was people that were going to the Civil War. But when you really look at it, if you look very carefully over the far right of the picture, you can see a cupola, a round cupola. That cupola was on top of Dean Hall, the first Dean Hall. And that Dean Hall was built between the years of 1866 and 1868. So that cupola had to have been built there between roughly 1867 at the earliest, definitely by 1868, but by 1872 it was burnt down. So this picture had to have been taken between 1868 and 1872.
Very good noticing.
Yeah.
It still could have been the town militia for many years, up until the creation of the National Guard in the early 20th century. Franklin and many other towns all throughout the country had their own militias, where they would elect local officers and be responsible for defense of the community, and in some cases would muster for major events like the Mexican-American War or the Civil War. So it may have been some sort of militia muster after the end of the Civil War.
Right, where it was like about 3 years after the end of the Civil War. It's very possible that they were still, thinking in terms of what's the next war going to be like. Right. Okay. Now here's a picture that was taken from the 1879 map of downtown Franklin, and you can see that that general store building was still there. Not too many other buildings were in that area though, but by 1888 they had really built up that block. And you can see some buildings that were around the general store building. You can see like number 37, and on West Central Street side, you can see a couple other new buildings. And those are the buildings that made up the quote-unquote Flax Block. And the reason we call it a Flax Block, you're going to notice that it was purchased in 1925 by a gentleman named Leo Flax. A lot of times, a block or a building will take on the name of the owner at the time. This block was actually owned by other people, but a lot of the newspaper articles talked about the Flax Blocks, and that's why I refer to it as the Flax Block. So, now this picture was taken in the early 1900s. The building with the 4 striped poles was a barber shop, and there was a pool room on the second floor of that building. And then the building just to the left of it was a shoe store. Ethan Allen Moore was the owner of that store. And then here's a picture that was taken in the early 1900s. And I say 1900s because you can see the streetcar tracks in the road.
It also looks like an early automobile in the center of the picture.
Right, so it's got to be at least after 1900, probably even up till 1910 or so. So we see buildings such as Elkerton's Bakery. We see, now the building that we see that had the piazza is gone now. A gentleman by the name of Harry Batchelor owned the store there. So this was in the early 1900s. Elkerton's Bakery's there, Harry Batchelor's store, Ethan Allen's Moore store, and the barber shops from left to right. So let's take a look at each one of these buildings from left to right. What we have here is the Sanborn fire map from 1894. I'm sorry, 1894. And the building that we show there, we see it's got 3 arches. And that particular business was owned by a gentleman named E. King. He had a hairdressing store there. And I happened to show, you can see that there's an advertisement from the 1893 business book. It says King, E.E. That's the guy that was there in that barber shop. And
certainly a classy architectural oddity, that building.
I know.
With the arches and its very, very small footprint.
And then the arrow points to the barber shop on the map. The building next to it was part of the bakery, and you can see where it says Bake House. So it's just part of the bakery. And the next building was the actual bakery, the bakery itself, that was owned by Elkerton. It was formerly occupied by E. Lovell Metcalf. That would be the father of Lorraine Metcalf. In June of 1900, barely 1 week after the bakery opened, there was a fire in the building. It was discovered in a closet in a room above the oven at the rear of the building, and it spread into the roof. The cause was believed to be spontaneous combustion. And the fire was quickly put out, and Mr. Elkerton resumed business the next day. So it couldn't have been too bad of a fire. So, and then Harry Batchelor's store is there. And you can see on this map, you can see that the piazza is shown, but that was in 1894.
What was his shop specializing in?
He was like a newspaper dealer. And he also sold cigars, apothecaries, and different things, but just a general store. And then as we go around the corner, we see Ethan Allen Moore's shoe store. And a better picture of Ethan Allen Moore's shoe store is this. This is taken from one of the Franklin directories. And you can see the sign that's just Ethan Allen Shoe Store. And then next to it was the barbershop, Bill Jordan's barbershop. And you can see from the map, it tells that there was a pool room up on the second floor. Now, in February of 1883, a gentleman named Charles Buttman bought this block. He bought it from J.M. Stewart. You can see this map shows J.M. Stewart was the owner. And then in March of 1920, Harry Bullock bought the block. And he had no immediate plans for improvement of the property, but he did later on, and as we're going to see in a few minutes. But this plot of land, it included the Batchelor store, the Jordan barbershop, and whatever. Now you notice how there's the land comes to a point at the end, right where the town bridge is. We're going to be talking about that because that presented a problem for Harry Bullock. And so the different stores now that were in that block. In March of 1920, Robert Doherty purchased the shoe store of Ethan Allen Moore, and he sold it to him because of his declining health. And then later that year, Ethan Allen Moore died. So now it became Doherty's shoe store.
And I noticed that this is selling house shoes, in other words, slippers, for people who had, probably at the time, very poorly insulated homes, very cold floors, very drafty in many cases, or simply wanted to keep their houses clean inside, especially at a time before vacuum cleaners, when that would have been a much more challenging activity than it is today.
That's for sure, yeah, that's for sure. Now, in October of 1922, Harry Bullock, who now owns this land, he petitioned the land court for the registration of the title for that triangular parcel of land that was in front of the Batchelor store. Well, apparently, he wanted to tear down the buildings that were there, the bakery and all the other buildings in that block, and he wanted to build something new. But he thought that his land went out to that point, and the town was opposed to his petition. He said that the town told him that he couldn't build on that land because it had been used for many years as a public highway, and he lost the rights to build on it.
And it's still a public highway today.
It's still a public highway to this day, right. Now Harry claimed that his deed showed that he owned that land, and he owned it, the land extending to within 12 feet of the watering trough. But the selectmen maintained that the town had title to the land since it had been used as a public way for many years. But by December of 1922, the land court decided that Harry Bullock could only claim the land that was beyond the building lines that had been occupied by the piazza. See, that's why I mentioned the piazza. But by 1924, in December, Harry Bullock decided enough is enough. He decided to sell the property. So he sold it to Leo J. Flax of Cambridge, and that's why I refer to it as the Flax Block. And you'll see in upcoming advertisements, they refer to it as the Flax Block. So now, 2 months later, Leo Flax decided he wanted to tear down the buildings and he wanted to build the block, the new business block there. So all the store owners had to vacate in order for him to build his block. So the tenants had to move out. The advertisement on the left shows Robert Doherty having a big sale saying he has to vacate by March 1st so that the building can be tore down to make room for a new block. So he moved his business down to the other end of Main Street, to 58 Main Street. And that's where he stayed until the new Flax Block was opened, and he moved back to his original location, but now in the new Flax Block. He says, it was moving day yesterday for me, and I hope it's the last. So, and then later that year, in November of 1925, Max Berezin had to vacate his store at 8 Main Street because his lease was expiring. And then in June, the following June, John Dio retired and Max Berezin took over his store at 20 Main Street. 20 Main Street was in the Metcalf block. And then in May of 1926, Leo Flax sold that property to a gentleman by the name of Morris Kaplan. He was a well-known boxer who was better known as Red Chapman. And he sold that block for approximately $60,000. Yeah. And then 3 months later, Red Chapman tore down the building that was between the Flax Block and the Buttman building. Now that was the building that originally housed the pool room and the barber shop. And in its place, he built a new building. And the new building closely resembled, it was patterned after the Flax Block itself. And the next picture will show. This is a picture that I took from Google Earth, and it shows the new building that was put there. Now, that building, if you were standing at street level and you were looking at that building, you would think, oh, it's part of the original building, but it was not. You can see that the original Flax Block, as it was built, looks like a giant U or maybe a V with a very round bottom, but that was the original Flax Block. The building to the right of the building with the arrow, that was the so-called Buttman building, and that was already there.
And I can attest, still a popular roosting spot for pigeons at night.
Oh,
every bird in downtown Franklin swarms to that roof every day, it seems.
I've got pictures that show it. Unbelievable. Yep. So that was a separate building. And then, this was an ad from April of 1926. Ralph Davis, no relation, I don't think, to Harry Davis, but Ralph Davis had a store in the Flax Block, but over on the West Central Street side. And he decided to move his business over to on the other side of Main Street in the Flax Block, but in that new building that we just talked about. So Ralph Davis moved his store into the new building that had just been completed. And then in July of 1930, Ralph Davis sold his store, and he sold it to somebody else, and he had a closing out sale. And at that time, it became the Franklin Bargain Store. And then in December of 1932, Robert Doherty sold his business at 4 Main Street to Barnett Kaplan, a local tailor. And Mr. Kaplan owned this business until 1963 when he retired. And then at the time that he sold the business, he put a big thank you note in the newspaper. He said, I want to take this opportunity to extend to you my sincerest appreciation for the sustained patronage, etc. And please, I trust that this same loyalty will be continued on behalf of my successor, Mr. Barnett Kaplan. So, and then Barney Kaplan owned that store until 1963 when he retired. So, and then another establishment that was located in the Flax Block was the Elite Barbershop. This business began doing business in Franklin in 1927. I'm not sure if they started there, but definitely they were there by 1935 when this picture was taken. In fact, this picture was taken from one of the Chilson films, and we'll show that scene at some point during this presentation. Some of the other businesses that were in this block over on the West Central Street side was the Electric Cafe. And at one point, it became under the management of Benny Gillinado. Now, Benny Gillinado was well known as an oil man in Franklin, but at that time, at this time anyway, he took over the Electric Cafe, and said, "Benny will greet you at the bar," according to the advertisement. So I thought that was kind of nice. And there was a grocery store located at this in this corner. It was called Strickland and Rustino, and there's a picture of it there, and a little advertisement.
A full line of Bird's Eye, the rise of frozen foods, the next exciting new thing now that canned food were on the way out in the 1950s.
And TV dinners too.
Can't forget those.
I had a few of them myself. And then there was a popular television repair service located there, A&D Television, and they came to our house a few times, to bring the tubes and change the tubes right there and repair the televisions right on your home. And then there's a picture showing, this is probably, well, you can see a 1959 Chevy there, so this was taken in probably the early 60s. So, now there was a big thing that was coming down, that was going to happen in Franklin in the 1960s. It was called urban renewal. It was a proposal, and it was never passed. But it would have changed the landscape of downtown Franklin dramatically.
And probably not for the better. Well,
probably not. They were really going to tear down a lot of the buildings. The Flax Block would have been torn down, and this was an artist's conception that was in the Sentinel at that time. And the Flax Block would have been totally replaced, as seen in that drawing, but it didn't get passed. So I know my mother was worried about it because we lived on Dean Avenue, and we were just on the fringe area, and it turns out our house probably wouldn't have been taken, but she was concerned. I remember she was really worried. Yeah. And here's a picture from around 1937 that shows the Flax Block, and there was no pigeons up on the roof at that time. And then here's one that was taken probably, I'm guessing, in the early 50s.
Is that truck in the foreground carrying 7-Up? I can't quite make out the
yeah, I really can't tell.
Emblem on the side of it.
Yeah, it's hard to say, really. But so.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive on the Flax Block. Thanks to Joe for guiding us through another chapter in downtown Franklin's history. I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
I'm Joe Landry.
Until next time, thanks for watching.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.